Right now, thousands of Australians are refusing to walk into a Hungry Jack's, convinced they're taking a stand against a war on the other side of the planet. Here's the part: almost none of them have actually checked. The company they're boycotting is 100% Australian-owned, has never issued a single public statement about that war, and had absolutely nothing to do with the decision that started this entire boycott in the first place. So today we're pulling this whole thing apart, separating what's genuinely documented from what's viral confusion, and showing you exactly what Hungry Jack's actually is behind that red and gold sign. Who really owns it, what it's actually worth, and why so many well-meaning people got the story wrong. This matters because Hungry Jack's is one of the biggest fast food chains in this country, sitting on nearly every major shopping strip from Perth to Cairns, employing tens of thousands of mostly young Australians on weekend and after-school shifts, and pulling in a genuine slice of the money Aussies spend on takeaway every week, right alongside Coles and Woolworths. When a boycott this size attaches itself to a brand like that, real people lose real shifts. Real small business owners who lease that shopfront lose real income, and almost none of them had any say in whatever sparked it. Whether you've already stopped going or you're hearing about this for the first time, you deserve the actual facts before you decide where your money goes next. The moment this all began, and it didn't begin in Australia at all. In October of 2023, in the days immediately after Hamas's attack on Israel and the war that followed in Gaza, a Burger King outlet inside Israel posted photos online showing staff packing up free meals for Israeli soldiers. Those images spread fast. Newsweek reported on the backlash within days, noting that social media accounts were already lumping Burger King together with McDonald's, Domino's, Pizza Hut, and Papa John's, all of whom had franchises inside Israel that had made similar public gestures toward the military. Calls to boycott the Burger King brand went global almost overnight, and barely any of those posts paused to explain which Burger King, in which specific country, under which specific ownership, had actually done the thing being condemned. That single missing detail turned out to matter more than almost anyone sharing it realized. This backlash followed months of an escalating war that's killed tens of thousands of people according to health authorities in Gaza, displaced enormous numbers of civilians, and dominated news cycles worldwide. Plenty of people sharing those boycott posts were reacting to genuine grief and anger about a serious humanitarian situation. This isn't about telling anyone their concern is misplaced. It's about making sure that concern actually lands on the company that earned it, rather than on the nearest Australian business, wearing a similar-looking sign run by a local franchisee, staffed by someone's kid on a Saturday shift. The BDS movement describes itself as a Palestinian-led campaign encouraging economic pressure on companies it considers directly tied to Israeli government policy or the Israeli military. It publishes its own criteria and its own list of targeted companies, and that formal list, the actual official one, has never included Hungry Jack's by name. What spread instead across Australian social media was secondary, informal boycott graphics and TikTok slideshows compiled by individual accounts, often bundling together dozens of brands with wildly different levels of connection to the conflict. Some direct, some indirect, some based on nothing more than a shared logo. That gap between an organization's actual published list and a stranger's reposted graphic is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost the moment something goes viral. The movement dates back to 2005, modeled loosely on the international boycott campaigns against apartheid-era South Africa, and describes its goals around three specific demands relating to occupation, equal rights, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Whatever anyone makes of those aims, the published list is not the same document as the unofficial graphics that did the rounds on Australian TikTok and Instagram. Within weeks of the original post, boycott tracking pages under hashtags like Free Palestine and Boycott List began circulating Burger King as a brand to avoid. Full stop. No country specified, no ownership breakdown. In Australia, that message landed exactly the way it was designed to. People saw the Burger King name, looked at their nearest Hungry Jack's, and assumed it was the same company. Amnesty published a piece in June of 2024 specifically addressing the boycott confusion, stating plainly that Hungry Jack's is not on the boycott list, is wholly Australian-owned, and has taken no official position at all on the conflict. That article had to exist because enough people genuinely believed otherwise and were already changing their weekly spending. Who actually owns Hungry Jack's? This is the single fact that undercuts the entire premise of the boycott. The brand was founded on the 19th of June 1971 in Inaloo, a suburb of Perth, by a Canadian-born Australian businessman named Jack Cowan, who'd already spent a couple of years building up a small chain of KFC outlets in Western Australia after buying the local rights back in 1969 using $10,000 borrowed from acquaintances back in Canada. In 1971, Cowan secured the master franchise rights to open Burger King restaurants across Australia, but discovered the Burger King name was already trademarked here by an entirely unrelated local confectionery business. Rather than fight that out in court, Cowan picked a different name straight off his own menu board and opened as Hungry Jack's instead. Hungry Jack's is run today through Cowan's privately held company, Competitive Foods Australia, headquartered in New South Wales. An entirely Australian business employing Australian staff, sourcing Australian beef, and paying Australian tax. It reports to nobody in Tel Aviv, nobody in Toronto, and nobody outside this country. It is not a subsidiary of whatever entity operates Burger King in Israel. It never has been, not for one single day since 1971. Competitive Foods. Australia reported an 18% jump in annual revenue to $2.4 billion in its most recent financial filing, with net profit landing at $74.1 million for the year. The company now runs somewhere between 440 and 480 Hungry Jack's outlets nationally, employs well over 16,000 people by some counts and more than 26,000 by others, depending on how casual and franchise staff are tallied, and plows roughly $75 million a year, straight back into rebuilding and upgrading its own stores. This is one of the largest privately owned companies in the country, built and still run by one Australian family's holding company, growing its revenue at a faster rate than most of its publicly listed competitors the same year the boycott confusion was at its loudest. The entire fast food and takeaway industry in Australia is worth somewhere around $30 billion a year, across more than 26,000 individual businesses, and Hungry Jack's sits as one of the 2 or 3 biggest single brands inside that number. A company that size doesn't disappear from a viral social media wave. It shows up in the annual accounts, and this year's accounts show growth, not decline. Jack Cowan is one of the more understated figures in Australian business. A self-made billionaire with an estimated personal fortune, sitting somewhere between $2.5 and $3.5 billion, depending on the year it's measured, who, alongside Hungry Jack's, has also chaired Domino's Pizza Enterprises, the separate publicly listed company running Domino's stores across Australia and several other countries. The boycott framing of a shadowy overseas corporation quietly funding a war doesn't match the reality of one Perth-based businessman running an Australian company that stayed deliberately quiet on the entire subject. The Burger King name is licensed out around the world under a master franchise system, and each region's operator runs as its own genuinely independent business with its own board, its own bank accounts, and its own decisions. The global head office, Restaurant Brands International, is based across Canada and the United States and holds no operations, no staff, and no investments inside Israel whatsoever. The Israeli operation itself is a completely separate company, majority owned roughly 93% by most, reporting by an Israeli firm called Delek Israel, run by businessmen Avi Levy and Eli Lavi, who bought that franchise license back in 2022. And then sitting well outside both of those is Hungry Jack's, run entirely by Competitive Foods Australia, with zero ownership crossover with either of the other two. 3 separate boardrooms, 3 separate sets of shareholders, 3 separate decision makers, all trading under variations of the same burger logo purely because of a licensing agreement signed decades ago. Boycotting one because of a decision made entirely by a different one is a bit like refusing to shop at an independently owned local IGA, because you're furious at a decision made inside Woolworth's head office. Defenders of the boycott have correctly pointed out that McDonald's Israel also donated meals to soldiers during the same period, which is true and well documented. What often gets left out is that McDonald's Kuwait publicly donated roughly $250,000 to Palestinian relief efforts around that exact same window, and franchises in several other countries, including Pakistan, did the same. Same golden arches, same global brand, completely opposite actions in different countries because they're run by entirely different local operators making entirely their own calls with their own money. That's simply how international franchising has worked for decades. You cannot assume what one country's franchise did just because you know what a different country's franchise did. As of the time we're recording this, Hungry Jack's and Competitive Foods Australia have not issued any public statement addressing the Israel-Gaza conflict, taking neither side, condemning neither action, expressing solidarity with neither group. To some customers, that silence reads as sensible. To others, silence itself feels like a non-answer. Both reactions are genuinely held, and neither changes the underlying corporate structure. Anyone claiming Hungry Jack's has spoken out, either in support of the boycott or against it, is simply incorrect. There is no statement to point to because none has actually been made. Every version of this story that includes a quote, a statement, or an official Hungry Jack's position on the war is by definition fabricated or borrowed from an entirely different company. In Western Australia, Hungry Jack's opened its first fully halal certified outlet decades after the brand first launched. A genuine operational decision made locally to serve a specific Australian community better. Several outlets in South Australia have followed the same path, publicly promoted through halal food community pages. It's a small detail, and it doesn't erase anyone's legitimate feelings about the broader conflict. But it's hard to square a local business quietly pursuing halal certification for its own Australian customers with the idea that the same business is secretly aligned against the interests of Muslim Australians specifically, which is one of the more common claims attached to the boycott online. Halal certification typically means separating supply chains, retraining kitchen staff, and passing regular audits, all of which costs real money and real operational effort. The overwhelming majority of Hungry Jack's outlets are company-owned through Competitive Foods Australia, with a smaller share operated by independent local franchises. On the ground, it's ordinary staff and store managers who never made a single decision about any of this. Store managers can now earn up to $200,000 to $300,000 a year under Cowan's profit-sharing model. But the vast bulk of the workforce is still teenagers and young adults working weekend and after-school shifts on ordinary award wages, with zero input into what a completely separate company on the other side of the world chose to do back in October of 2023. When a boycott built on a mix-up lands on a specific suburb, it's the till operator on a quiet Tuesday night shift wondering why traffic's dropped off. Multiply that across 440-odd stores nationally, and you're talking about a large slice of Australia's teenage and early 20s workforce, absorbing consequences for a decision made in a country most of them have never visited. Search hard enough, and you'll find plenty of boycott directory websites listing Burger King as a target, and plenty of confident claims about collapsing sales. What you won't find is an actual measured sales figure for Hungry Jack's, specifically inside Australia, tied directly to this boycott. And the 18% revenue jump certainly doesn't support one. Competitive Foods Australia is a private company and isn't required to publish quarterly revenue, which means claims about millions of Australians boycotting are viral social media momentum rather than confirmed commercial data. Compare that to what's been documented overseas. Reporting from Time magazine described the boycott movement as posing an existential threat to fast food franchises across several Muslim-majority countries in the Middle, East, and Southeast Asia, with real reported drops in foot traffic and revenue at specific named locations. That's the version with real receipts. The Australian version so far is mostly noise without a confirmed number underneath it. None of this spread by accident. Platforms like TikTok and Instagram reward whatever keeps people watching and reacting the longest. A short clip accusing a familiar brand of funding a war will almost always outperform a slower video walking through franchise ownership structures and a trademark dispute from 1971. A single graphic gets reshared thousands of times in an afternoon, while a nuanced correction sits with a few dozen views months later. Researchers at MIT studied roughly 126,000 stories spreading on social media and found that false claims consistently traveled further, faster, and to more people than accurate ones, largely because novelty and outrage get rewarded by the same mechanics that decide what shows up on your feed. Strip the geopolitics out completely, and Hungry Jack's still has a real, well-documented customer satisfaction problem of its own making. Independent review site Complaints Board lists Hungry Jack's Australia with an average rating of just 1.1 out of 5 across hundreds of logged complaints, the overwhelming majority describing cold food on delivery, incorrect or missing items, and slow or unresponsive customer service. ProductReview.com.au tells largely the same story. None of that has anything to do with Israel, Gaza, or any boycott list. It's simply a fast food chain that has a genuine trust problem with a real chunk of its own paying customer base. It's entirely possible that some people who believe they stopped going specifically over the war actually stopped going because of a cold Whopper and a missing box of onion rings months earlier, and simply found a more shareable reason to explain it after the fact. As of last year, a small cheeseburger off the value range sat around $3.50 to $4.50, while a standard Whopper meal ran somewhere between $13 and $15, depending on the store and whether you ordered through a delivery app, which typically adds another 15 to 30% on top. Cowan himself has openly acknowledged that average Hungry Jack's store footprints have shrunk by roughly 20% in recent years as building costs and red tape have climbed, and has said plainly that rising costs simply have to be passed on somewhere to keep the business profitable. The Australian Bureau of Statistics recorded meals out and takeaway food prices rising 4% in the 12 months to June 2024 alone, well ahead of overall inflation. The chain still heavily markets a loose change menu built around items under $5. When the actual price of a quick meal keeps drifting upward across the entire industry, that's a genuine everyday apolitical reason for a household to quietly switch to a different burger chain or just skip takeaway altogether. No boycott list required. Despite roughly 2 years of boycott confusion, unverified claims, and a damaged public conversation around its name, Hungry Jack's hasn't been shrinking. It's been doing the opposite, revenue up 18% in the most recent financial year, net profit climbing alongside it. Store investment running at roughly $75 million annually, and major national sponsorship deals, including tie-ins with basketball competitions. A chain that's supposedly the target of a boycott involving millions of Australians is at the same time posting some of its strongest financial results in years. Maybe that's proof the boycott's real impact has been wildly overstated online. Maybe it's proof the confusion never reached as many paying customers as the loudest posts suggested. Maybe both are true at once. Either way, it's worth sitting with the gap between what the internet insists is happening and what the company's own audited numbers actually show. Because that gap is exactly where misinformation does its quietest, most effective work. So here's what we suggest doing before you decide who deserves your money. First, don't take a repost at face value, no matter how many times you've seen it shared by people you trust, because the number of times something's been shared has never once been evidence that it's actually true. Second, remember that any Australian business's ownership structure is a matter of public record through ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. And it costs nothing. It takes a few minutes to search a company name and see who's actually behind it. Third, if a claim about a brand can't point you to an actual statement from that specific company in that specific country, treat the claim as unverified until it actually can. Fourth, check whether the boycott list you're looking at is the movement's own official published list, or just somebody's reposted graphic bundling together brands with wildly different levels of connection. And separately from all of that, hold the ordinary everyday stuff to account too. The cold food, the missing items, the price creep, because that's the part every customer can check for themselves with their own two eyes and their own receipt.